Thank you, and thank you, Chikonde. I enjoyed hearing you speak. I've just jotted down a few points. I'm just going to go through them very quickly. Let us not be afraid of asking the hard questions. We know what delivers growth. We've seen it done in China, India, South Africa. It is not aid. It is not the system that Africa is relying on right now. I think it's laughable. At a time when the world is growing at potentially 0.5 as a global society, many countries and many regions are going to have negative growth. Africa is expected to have, these are IMF statistics, is going to have at least 3% growth. We should not be sitting here saying, let's give Africa another $50 billion. Let's find out, how is it that possible that Africa is growing so relatively rapidly in this time? That sounds to me like positive news. Besides, what has happened? We've just come out of one of the greatest bull runs in commodity markets over the past 10 years. Let's ask the question, where is that money? What has happened to the money that African countries have got? I don't want to hear any more about, we should get more aid. I want to know what has happened to that money. Besides, in addition to that point, I would also say that we're in the middle of a credit crisis. No society has the right to sit on its laurels and expect somebody else to underwrite its systems. The African governments should have anticipated a time when aid would not be a large part of their financing. They didn't. Neither did the donor community. I wish I could sit here and say African governments can be held accountable, will be held accountable, that conditionalities work. I wouldn't be here if that was true. The reality is it's not true. And we all know that giving money for nothing at anywhere, anytime, and any place on this earth does not yield the right incentives. We want accountability. You'll only get accountability if the governments are responsible and respond to their people, not to donors, not to the international community, not to the celebrities, but to their people. How do we get that? They need to be able to grow a middle class. The estimates that are from the UN estimates of how fast Africa has to be growing, 7% a year. We have not seen those estimates, barred this last few years with the commodity boom. That type of figure has not happened. It seems to me, given the amount of money that has gone to Africa over the past 60 years, we should have done much better. Again, we know what works. We know more trade is better than less trade. We know countries that have relied on aid have done consistently worse than countries that have not. We know that at the end of the day, the countries that have shown long-term economic success have not sat around waiting on open-ended commitments of aid. And as far as I'm concerned, African governments should not be sitting back in a world where, when the world is imploding and the budgetary constraints are becoming much tighter in donor countries, we should not be sitting around and saying, they owe us, oh, I'll let you know. It's only been 60 years, you owe me aid for conservative. 3% growth this year. If you look at trade across African countries, and I'll give you a specific example. I was invited to meet with President Kagame of Rwanda in February on the back of the book, went to visit him, went to Rwanda, Kenya, and Tanzania, 3 countries near each other. Rwanda, just to illustrate, is only about 10 million people. 3 countries, I needed 3 visas and to change my currency 3 times. It's that kind of absurdity which I think is ridiculous. The trade situation in Africa is not just about trading outside of Africa, it's even within Africa. Some of the tariff rates across the continent are still 35% between countries. It's that kind of thing that I'm talking about. We're talking about innovation here. Yes, things are going to be challenging, but we cannot sit back and say, oh, could the G20 or G8 please give us more money? There is no more money. It's time to start to innovate, and there are a lot of opportunities to do that. Yes, the Chinese are in Africa. They're still sitting on $4 trillion of reserves. There's scope for innovation and building alliances there vis-a-vis trade. There are 1.3 billion people, 7% arable land. I'm not saying it's carte blanche for the Chinese. We need accountable governments so that they can manage those relationships in the interest of the African people. But there's a lot more scope. I talk about trade, foreign direct investment, capital markets, microfinance. There's so many other ways of piecing together a mix that is much more transparent, holds the government more accountable, and is much more efficient, as we have seen in many countries in delivering long-term growth and reducing poverty, than the state aid models of development. African countries doing today in anticipation that when the market comes back, are they going to be ready to come and issue bonds in the market? I think it's only 15 countries that have credit ratings in Africa. That's the debate I want to have. I talk about microfinance on a more individual level, remittances. There's lots of other stuff in the book. Africa is not going to meet any of the 2015 Millennium Development Goals. It's not me who's saying this. It's the architects of the Millennium Development Goals themselves who have said, Africa will not meet any of those goals. 2015 is around the corner. They've put in money, put in effort to this. It's not going to happen. Just the way that they have a targeted goal, they came up with the 2015 goal, I'm recommending the same approach for aid. Have a finite, targeted, short, sharp intervention with regards to aid. I'm even willing to say, if you give Zambia 5 years or 10 years or whatever, a finite target, you can even double the aid in that period. But when it comes time to shutting off the tap or to reducing significantly, weaning Africa off of the tap, it has to be credible. The programs that I talk about in the book, a bit of the history of aid, places like the Marshall Plan, where people say, a lot of aid advocates say, look, it worked in the Marshall Plan. It was because those type of interventions were finite, not because they're open-ended commitments to the point where African governments think it's actually permanent income. And you're absolutely right. We need to innovate, and that is really what we're focusing on here.
Okay, how young the populations are in Africa. If these children do not have opportunities, it's going to be a much, much worse situation. I think a lot of the failed states and the political problems that we're seeing across the country, particularly in environmental challenges and resource constraints, it will only get worse. I do think there has been some movement in the right direction on education in a very microcosmic way and healthcare. As I said, my concern is that a lot of times that's from NGOs and what I consider temporary support as opposed to really long-term sustainable types of interventions. And besides, we have a more fundamental situation which I touched on earlier. Yes, girls can go to school and get an education. That's great. Are these economies growing fast enough to ensure that these children get jobs? No. You only have to go anywhere across Africa. You're right, it's not one country. Go to these places, Nigeria, Zambia, Kenya, visit and see how many young people are on the streets, and you'll know what I'm talking about.